All right, so right now we're going to be talking about observations and inferences. So, science, once upon a time, like people used to answer questions. So, let's say there was an eclipse in the middle of the day, or like the crops, they all just died in the middle of like while they were in planting season, right? So, the way they used to explain these things was like they would attribute it to like we've angered the spirits or we've angered the gods, those kinds of things, right? That's how they would try to explain like things that would happen out in the world, or as they say, natural phenomena, right? So what they realized though is eventually that these weren't the reasons why things were happening. If the crops were going bad, they started thinking and like scientists, right? They started using something called the scientific method, and it was basically just using logic to answer questions. So again, if the crops went bad, maybe it's because the soil wasn't right, right? Maybe it was too salty or too acidic, not acidic enough, and so and then the eclipse, right? It wasn't that. I think it was the Aztecs used to sacrifice someone every day to have the sun come up. But again, like they realized that that's not the case, right? There are actual logical reasonings behind the sun rising or even having an eclipse in the middle of the day, right? So that all starts with observations and inferences, right? So again, going from this, trying to explain it through, again, angering the gods or the spirits or things like that, some things that's like supernatural, we started shifting towards the scientific method. And so when you think like a scientist, the main thing is just remember, question everything, right? Don't just assume that what people tell you is the truth. And so the scientific method starts with observations. You just observe something happening in the world and you're just like, well, why is this happening? I notice that this is happening, but why is it happening? Right. So observations start with the senses. So you can see something and notice a difference going on, or just something that you observe. Taste, hearing, smell, touch. So again, you observe with your five senses, and this is how the scientific method starts. This is how science starts. You just observe something going on, and you ask yourself, again, using your five senses to gather this information, and then you come up with some observations. And so there are actually a couple types of observations. One type of observation is what's known as a quantitative observation. And we actually saw these words when we were talking about what is IPC, right? And I mentioned that we would talk about them a little bit more. So quantitative observations are just observations that deal with numbers and amounts, right? So again, it could be like 3 centimeters of rain, or it could be 2 meters of snow, or it could be 50 degrees Celsius, right? All of those have numbers with them. Or you could say that there were 50 male chimps in the population, right? All numbers, quantity, numbers. And then there are qualitative observations. So these are things that are just described that you don't necessarily use numbers, right? So if you're talking about the behavior of something, right? The chimpanzee was aggressive. And I was talking about like chimpanzees and gorillas because I used to study them in college, which was really cool, right? But things like the texture of the fur, or the color of something. And so again, you're describing things, you're making observations, but for qualitative, you don't use numbers. All right. So quantitative, you use numbers. Qualitative, you do not use numbers to describe something. Right. And so now what are some observations that we can make about, actually some quantitative observations that we can make about this classroom, or whatever room it is that you're in at the moment? Right. So just take some time and observe what's around you. So those are quantitative. What are some qualitative observations you can make about the room that you're in? And to remember, an inference, to make an inference is to explain the things you observe, right? So before you can even make an inference, you have to make some sort of observation. And then once you make that observation, then you can make an inference, right? So let's see. An example of an inference is the observation is that the sky is dark and cloudy. All right. And so you have to have that observation before you make the inference. But once you have that observation that the sky is dark and cloudy, now you can make an inference about it. So you observe the sky is dark and cloudy and you infer that it is going to storm. Right. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen, but there's a good chance that if it does look like it's going to storm, then you can infer that it's going to storm, right? May not be 100% accurate, but that's what science is. Science isn't always 100%, but you got to kind of make a guess as to what's going to happen, right? That's a good thing about science, is you try to make predictions about what's going to happen based on previous patterns, right? So let's see an example here. Now you go ahead and make an observation, and then make an inference about the observation that you made. All right. In this next activity, that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a series of three images. For each image that you observe, make sure that you write two observations and one inference for each one. All right. So do not share your observations or inferences until you're asked to do so. And we'll talk about that why in a minute. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and show you the first image. You go ahead and write down two observations that you can see and then one inference based off of those observations. All right. So record two observations and make an inference. And then we're going to discuss this observations and these inferences. All right. So in this slide, go ahead and record two observations that you see right there in the second image to the right. And then after you make those two observations, and then remember, an observation is something that you observe with your senses. In this case, it would be sight, right? So we're using our eyes to make these observations. And once you make those two observations about the second image, go ahead and make an inference also. And remember, an inference is just an idea that you have about the observation that you made. Right. So an observation, two or more people will agree on the same thing, and an inference, you don't necessarily have to, right? Just kind of something that you're coming up with based off of the observation you made. And then here for the third image, go ahead and again, this is the one all the way to the right now. Go ahead and make two observations. Again, something that you see with your senses, in this case, your eyes. Make two of those observations, and then go ahead and make an inference. And then we'll discuss this a little bit after you make your inference.